Welcome, folks. We're just going to fill the air a little bit till everybody gets to join. And we'll get started in one moment. You're here, of course, for the Q&A for the film Upheaval. And we'll get started in just a minute. Let's give people some time to get adjusted, get used to their Zoom again. We've been in person our last few events. Nice to be back on the Zoom. Okay, folks, I think we're going to get things going. Just to kind of tell you about some upcoming events. Tomorrow night, we start our Israel Film Center Festival, which is running from the 15th till the 29th, with a few great, the best new Israeli cinema, feature films coming out. Oh, sorry for the noise behind me. We'll pause for a moment. Okay, folks, we're back. That noisy motorcycle has left the neighborhood. I decided to enjoy the beautiful weather and do this outside. That'll teach me. So we have wonderful films coming out of Israel, some of the best new Israeli cinema coming to you this week. We tried to make it also digestible and accessible by not having too many films, but really choosing a nice group of films. Tomorrow night we have a screening on the rooftop of Sublet, and then we have Honeymoon coming up, and many other of the best films out of Israel from this past year. So please check it all out at israelfilmcenter.org/festival, and you can get a pass and enjoy the entire festival. Tonight's film, Upheaval, this is the second film about Menachem Begin that we're screening this year. And we're really excited, and the timing on this one couldn't have been any better. Really, as the headlines in all the Israeli papers, as Jonathan Gruber, the director, and I were discussing a moment ago, were mahapach. There was really, once again in Israel, we are witnessing a little bit of a revolution, and we'll jump into that a little bit and connect this to current affairs if you don't mind. But we're happy to have here the director of the film, Jonathan Gruber. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Isaac, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining.
And I'll ask a few questions and then we'll open it up to your questions. So please, audience, if you have any questions, put your questions in the chat, and Morgan will contact you and call on you. So Jonathan, just tell us maybe first of all, where did this all start? Let's go back to the beginning.
Sure. Rob Schwartz, our executive producer, it's really his vision. He was reading Yehuda Avner's Prime Ministers, book about 4 Israeli prime ministers, and he took a shine to Menachem Begin, and he was former chief of staff for Joe Lieberman. And Joe Lieberman, and they were talking, and turns out they both read the book, and they both took a shine to Begin. And Rob said, well, I really want to make a documentary because I can't find anything out there. And so Joe said, well, I'll help you in any way I can. And that was, who knows, 3-4 years ago. And so Rob went on this quest to start to raise funds and to get people to get behind the idea that really the story of Menachem Begin needed to be told. This is the first English language feature documentary on Menachem Begin. And as you said, there just came out a Hebrew one, which was a 3-part series they turned into a feature. So that's a slightly different take on it. And for people who've seen both, happy to talk about the differences there. And then they brought me in a couple of years ago to direct it, and was grateful for the opportunity too, and learned a tremendous amount about the man. So that's some of the background.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that sets this film out from the other film wasn't really about the story of his life, but more so kind of specifically dealing on the topic of I'd say the relationship with our Arab neighbors, and I think that's really where the focus was. It touched a little bit, but I remember seeing yours after seeing the other one, and you really get the full picture of who Menachem Begin was out of yours, and where he came from, and much more the scope of his work.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump into the title, which I think is very timely. Upheaval. What's so significant about that as far as Menachem Begin and that and what that part plays in his identity?
Sure. So we were, trying to figure out, a title means a lot, and even though it starts with a U, so it comes at the end of a lot of festival listings. When Menachem Begin, and for people who are on this this Zoom, if you've seen it, then you know that the night that he was elected, Chaim Yavin, who is the very famous voice of Israel television, said Yesh Ma'apach, and Ma'apach means upheaval, but it's more, for me, Menachem Begin's life was upheaval, starting with the anti-Semitism that he faced growing up in Poland, to World War II and being on the run, separating from his wife, being put in the Gulag in the Soviet Union, then coming to Israel, fighting against the British, fighting against the Arabs, fighting against David Ben-Gurion in the government, and then fighting for his political life in many ways. I mean, being in the opposition for 30 years, there was a lot of upheaval, and then the actual election, upheaval in the peace accords, upheaval in terms of how he upended sort of the notion that the Ashkenazi European Jews were the elite of Israel, and bringing in the Mizrahi Jews. And then the Lebanon War, of course, was tremendous upheaval. So it felt like that was a really fitting title to put on the film.
I couldn't agree more. And his impact, of course, on Israeli politics today. He is the person that led the Likud party into power for the first time, out of the opposition, out of the shadow. And that, of course, is Benjamin Netanyahu's party that continued to have somewhat control back and forth a little bit since the 70s. And of course, over the last 12 years, most specifically. Let's talk about that relationship to today, and how I actually want to start. One of the things that I loved about the film is seeing Begin. He's not like the politicians of Israel of today. We got, for those of you who are following the news in the last couple of weeks, you got to meet some of the cast of characters that are playing in Israeli politics right now, but none of them, I think, have the backbone that that Begin had. It was a different time for politics, and I think in many ways, Begin was able to really stick to what he believed in, as other politicians at that time were also a lot less cynical. How do you see Begin standing out? And if Begin was around today, where would he be in the politics?
Well, it's funny. I think it was the second of the four elections that both the Likud was saying, well, we are the descendants of Menachem Begin, and so you should vote for us. And then Benny Gantz and Blue and White were saying that Netanyahu and Likud should be ashamed, or Begin would be ashamed of what the Likud has become. So Menachem Begin became sort of the person who people were saying, we are the true descendants of Menachem Begin. Where he would be, I'm not sure. I mean, he's one of the founding fathers of Israel, and he was shaped by the Holocaust. And I think seeing his family, almost his entire family, wiped out, everything was filtered through that. Thankfully, the politicians of today, don't have that experience. But everything he did, whether it was bombing the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq, or going into Lebanon when rockets were being fired, or fighting against the British, his assessment was that Jews are the only people who will be able to defend themselves, that they're the only ones that Jews can only rely on Jews, basically. And, I'm not really sure where, the thing I would say about Naftali Bennett that's really interesting is that he has crossed over into certain areas that people never thought that he would, in terms of where he was campaigning. And in some ways that is similar to Menachem Begin and the peace treaty that he made with Egypt, in that he had to give back land for peace, and places that I think it was that one of the seaside towns in Sinai was where he was going to retire. And so he gave that up in order to have peace. And then he had to convince people in the right wing in his own party that this was the right thing to do. And so I do see some correlation between Naftali Bennett sort of being pragmatic and looking and saying, this is what what we have to do to form a coalition, and working with people that I maybe never would have thought I would have, but that's what we have to do to get things done. And that's also what Begin did.
It's a very interesting comparison, and I don't know if Bennett can be a Begin, but yes, I mean, knowing sometimes that it's worthwhile to make these sacrifices for the better of the country, I would hope, and not just for the better of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
How would you say Begin is remembered today in Israel as far as a prime minister goes? What is he best remembered?
No, I just think he's got a complicated legacy, and that's really what we wanted to convey in the film. We did not want it to be hagiographic. It's overall positive about him. I think he deserves to have that positive legacy. But many of the things that he did, the expansion of the settlements, for instance, the legacy of the Lebanon War, Sabra and Shatila, even going back to before the state was founded in Deir Yassin. I mean, these are things that are very complicated and play into this narrative of both what Israelis and both what the Jewish narrative as well as the Palestinian narrative, and it's very complicated. And he's a part of that. And blowing up the King David Hotel. I mean, these are the question is, was he a terrorist? Was he a freedom fighter? Was he your terrorist? Was he your freedom fighter? And in terms of the legacy of what he's done as, there's so much to discuss, because he's really one of the founding fathers and was in Israel from the 40s until the 80s, really in public life. So for 40 years. But the legacy, again, of what I said about the Mizrahim, and bringing in those Sephardi, those Middle Eastern and North African Jews, to the point that now it's a majority Mizrahi country, and that the discrimination against them, he was the one who broke that down. He brought Ethiopian Jews into sort of the first secret mission. He brought Vietnamese refugees in, which is featured in the film. So I think a lot of his legacy is about an inclusive Israel, a multicultural Israel, where the strength of Israel is in its diversity, and it's unified in how different people can be and still get along in some ways. I mean, obviously it's a democracy, and it's fractious in many ways as well, but it's a complicated country, and he's a complicated man, and that's what we wanted to convey.
It really is. I mean, his powerful approach that he kind of took to everything, and never really, most of the early part of his career never compromising, and then finding these compromises later in his life, I think also lead to that complexity and to that very diverse picture that we get to see. Really, what stands out is I think he was very impactful with the Mizrahi Jewish community, as far as kind of really changing the approach of Israel in general to that community and having diversity. And that doesn't completely fit in for me into what you would normally expect from a right-wing leader. How do you make sense of it?
Well, I think he had real liberal democratic values, and part of what drove him also was the rule of law and what was fair and justice. He was a lawyer. He went to the University of Warsaw. And so even Arab Israelis who were under military rule from 1948 until the mid 60s, in the opposition, he was opposed to that. He said, listen, they're citizens and they should have the rights as citizens that that Jewish Israelis do. He was fighting for equal rights in many ways, and I think the idea was that if you were living in peace and you wanted to be a peaceful person, then you could have a lot of rights and take advantage of the benefits of Israel, and that if you wanted to fight against the Jews, then he was gonna fight against you. And that came from going all the way back to Beitar and Jabotinsky and the sort of what Rob Schwartz calls muscular Zionism, that we're going to stand up to you and we're not going to take it, and Jewish blood doesn't come cheap. So that's comes from Jabotinsky, and it comes from this idea that the Jews have had thousands of years of persecution, and again, they need to stand up for themselves.
Again, a very interesting character who really has, I think, a lot of complexities there, because I don't think it always, as someone who really came from that Ashkenazi background, for him to realize that his core audience, and the core audience that remains, I think, a big part of the Likud, has the fact that he would have to be more diverse in order to win over those votes and to change Israel in that way. I just think really makes for a great story, and I think you bring that up very nicely in the film.
Thank you. I mean, he was an underdog, and always was. He was little, and maybe there was some sort of connection there. He was connected to the underdog, whether it was Vietnamese refugees, as I said, no one else wanted to take, or the Mizrahim who were discriminated against. And it wasn't just that they provided political power for him. Once he was in, he put shekels, into something called Project Renewal and built up these development towns. I mean, for me, was so shocking to understand that these were people who had careers and standing in these Middle Eastern and North African countries, and they came and they were living in tents. In terms of the dignity that was taken away from them. And Menachem Begin was all about that. Beitar, one of the key words is hadar, which is dignity. And to see, so many of his fellow Jews, it didn't matter where they came from. It was that they were Jewish and that they were suffering. And so this Project Renewal, what's the end of the film is a song called Sion Tamati, which is sung by Rem Bashari, who grew up in one of these development towns, and the money from Project Renewal paid for music lessons, and that he became a musician in addition to a successful entrepreneur. So it's a nice sort of connection, that we have in real life, in our film to Begin, and the way that he connected to those people. I mean, he really was very humble. He was always thanking his wife. I mean, that was one thing that to me was so important to put into the film as well. He recognized it wasn't about me, the night that he's elected, and it's just beautiful that the first thing he says after nearly 30 years in the opposition is, I want to thank my wife, who was with me through the wilderness and a land littered with mines, and at other, whether it was a state dinner or other places, he's always thanking his wife. I mean, they loved each other, and it was really important to show that side of him as well. He was a fighter, he was a leader, he was a peacemaker, he was so a lot of people had very negative things about him, but he was also a lover, and a very sensitive man to his wife and his family.
And it seems ultimately he was also a very simple man, not looking out just to create his legacy, but really caring about Israel and the Jewish people, of course. I want to ask one more question and then take any comments and questions from the audience. I know the film hasn't screened in Israel yet, which hopefully will happen soon. But I'm curious to know the life of this film. Where is it going, and how can we tell other people to see this film?
Sure. So it's the baby's really just been born. We were in some festivals in the fall and early this year, and now the reason why we released it on June 7th, which was a Facebook Live event, was that was the 40th anniversary of the Osirak mission, the Operation Opera, and very timely. Sort of looking back, especially with what's going on in Iran and this sort of Begin doctrine that the Israeli leaders will never let a sworn enemy get nuclear weapons, no matter what, whether it's Syria or Iran or Iraq. And so anyway, now it's out, it's available. I mean, people have been able to see it through your website, which we're grateful for. Upheavalfilm.com is where people can see the film virtually right now. We don't have, as I said, the baby's been born. We're just kind of, changing its diapers and trying to figure out how to, how to push it out into the world. Virtual is new for everyone, but it's available on the website now, for the foreseeable future. What we hope is that we're having these sort of co-hosted affiliate screenings with organizations all around the world, actually. And then what we hope is later in the year or early next year, it'll be on public television, US public television, leading into sort of further distant March of next year is the 30th anniversary of Menachem Begin's death. So watch it now, upheavalfilm.com.
Thank you. Morgan, I'm going to hand things over to you to bring in questions from the audience.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Hopefully I will see you this week at our opening night tomorrow with Eitan Fox's new film, Sublet. But first, I'm going to start off by reading a question from someone named Bruno, actually. So Bruno asked, he said he recalls how Begin viewed and interacted with his wife. Do you think he might have responded or dealt differently with the Operation Peace in the Galil? Had his wife's health been in a better place in the early 1980s? Jonathan, I don't know if you know anything about that, maybe how his personal life interacted with his political life in that way.
Sure. I'm not good at hypotheticals, but I do know that he would not stand for rockets being fired from Lebanon, and that's why he went in. Now the war itself was expanded. The initial objective was reached, which was getting the rocket out of rocket range, pushing back the PLO. And then Ariel Sharon, as defense minister, convinced, or some say, didn't really share with Menachem Begin that Begin didn't really know what was going on, and pushed in. So and did it without Begin really knowing it, which is hard to say. How could Begin not know what was going on? But in some ways, he really trusted his military leaders. I don't know if the health or lack of health of his wife really had anything to do with the nature of the war, because it seems like it eventually went out of his hands, and it just kind of spiraled out of control and turned into a very tragic situation, not only for the loss of life of so many Israeli soldiers and the Lebanese and Palestinians. I mean, so much death, but then of course the Sabra and Shatila massacres, which happened with almost 1,000 Palestinians that were killed. So it's war and it's awful, and hard to say how it would have turned out based on Eliza's health.
Thank you.
And more, I see someone else wrote a direct message to me, said, when will the film be purchasable on, say, iTunes? And I think that'll be sometime sort of later this year. iTunes, Amazon, it will be available, but we're right now just in the sort of virtual cinema world, but probably in a few months.
So everyone has to spread the word now also, by the way, everyone. Tell your friends, it's still streaming for at least a few more days. And folks, again, if anyone else in the audience has questions, now is the time to send them in the chat. We can bring you on live to ask your question. But first up, Julian is going to ask a question. So Julian, you are on the air.
Okay. Hi there, Jonathan. Great movie. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Julian.
I was interested in the question of him opposing German reparations in principle. And I was wondering, was that something that his Herut party, which I guess was a predecessor to Likud, did they support that as a whole? Was that just a personal view?
Well, he was the leader of the party, and so they went along with him. I mean, it wasn't until I mean, it could have, you know, we know in Israel, right, there are lots of situations with Jewish people, 2 people, 3 opinions, but he was the leader and he was against German reparations. I would assume that he was supported by the people in his party, and you know that's one thing that wasn't in the film. We talked about his opposition to German reparations, but his steadfastness against it, that he riled up the crowd so much that there was a riot outside the Knesset, and they threw stones at the Knesset and broke windows. And Begin was found responsible for it and was banned from the Knesset, even though he was in the Knesset for several months. So I think that was, you know, one of the many things where he opposed Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion was being much more practical and said we were a poor country and we could use the money and the material. And I think what was really poignant in the film was Buria Ben Signor, who we interviewed, who was a teenager when and her father was in the Irgun, in the militia, and knew Begin, but she said that they were both right, Ben Gurion and Begin, that Begin was looking at the people who died and saying, how could you take this money, this blood money? And Ben Gurion was saying, well, this is, you know, we need the money for the people who are alive and to move forward.
Folks, once again, this is maybe your last call for questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our upcoming programs over the next week, just to give everyone 2 more minutes to type their questions in the chat. But again, the 9th annual Israel Film Center Festival kicks off tomorrow. We're screening Eitan Fox's new film, Sublet on the Roof. And then 2 of our other films, Nir Bergman's new film, Here We Are, and also the other new romantic comedy, Kiss Me Kosher, both start streaming tomorrow. We'll have Q&As with those filmmakers next week. And also next week, we're going to be streaming Shira Haas's new film, Asya. We just had a great live Q&A with her last week. And also Talia Levy's new film, who directed Zero Motivation a few years ago. Her new film, Honeymoon, will also be streaming with us. So we hope to see you there in person, hopefully, and virtually as well. And I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think we are officially calling it. Isaac.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Exciting to hear about the in-person screenings. It's fantastic.
This time we're hybrid, but we're definitely moving back to in-person. Jonathan, I want to thank you so much. Folks, thank you for being a part of this. Morgan, thank you for monitoring all the questions. And we look forward to seeing you at other wonderful films relating to Israel this week. So join us and help spread the word. Thank you all.
Thanks, Isaac. Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Rebecca,
Okay,
we're on the JCC rooftop. That's where we're at. So
upheavalfilm.com.
And also go check out Upheaval and please spread the word. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.